I want to start with a phrase that used to mean something specific in American politics and now gets thrown around like a rotten tomato at a county fair. Communist. Not as a serious argument, not as a policy label, just as a panic button. And right now, that panic button is getting smashed on repeat. Trump and Republicans are not just calling Democrat names, they're trying to turn the midterms into an ideological emergency, where every argument about taxes, healthcare, housing, or government becomes a story about hidden enemies, foreign-style takeover, and national survival. That's not accidental, that is the message. Trump has labeled Democratic candidates and the party's left flank as hardcore godless communists, called them the most serious threat to our country since its existence, and warned that Democrats want to completely destroy the traditional American way of life. He even tied communism to political violence, including assassinations, which tells you what kind of fear campaign this is. Not a debate over policy, but a moral panic with a voting booth attached. And that's where the absurdity starts to matter. Because once you realize the accusation is doing emotional work rather than factual work, the whole thing looks less like political analysis and more like an old propaganda script with better lighting. See, the Red Scare never disappeared. It just changed outfits, learned new catchphrases, and waited for a moment when a party needed a cleaner, louder, simpler enemy than whatever it was actually running on. That's why this current wave of anti-communist messaging feels so familiar. It has the same architecture as the old one. Fear first, details later, and if details become inconvenient, just raise the volume. Historically, Red Scare politics worked because they made anxiety into identity. You didn't need to prove a target was an actual communist in any coherent political sense. You only needed to make the label sticky enough that suspicion took over. That's the same playbook the GOP is drawing from now, and it's being used because the usual campaign language is weaker than it wants to be. When voters are stressed about affordability and frustrated by political fatigue, where the adults with a plan is hard to sell, their godless communist is a much easier chant. Trump's version of this messaging is especially broad. He's not just attacking a candidate here or a proposal there. He's building a whole worldview in which the left is linked to chaos, moral decay, and violence. At the Faith and Freedom Coalition conference, he painted Democratic candidates and the party's left flank as an existential threat. And his language has repeatedly blurred socialism, communism, and plain old liberal politics into one giant red blob. That kind of framing is useful because it turns a complicated electoral fight into a religious, civilizational, and emotional one. That's also why Republican leaders are echoing it. House Speaker Mike Johnson has warned that barbarians are inside the gate and said communism is now on our own shores, which is the sort of language that sounds less like legislative leadership and more like a bunker announcement from someone who's watched one too many black and white Cold War movies. The point is not accuracy, the point is siege psychology. Now, let's talk about the bizarre specifics, because the more specific the attack gets, the more ridiculous it sounds, and the more revealing it becomes. In my state, the great state of Florida, Republicans put up a highway billboard calling Democratic Representative Kathy Castor a communist over her photo with the line, "Communism, Tampa's enemy number one, and vote Republican." Fact checkers called the claim completely false and indefensible, which is one of those rare moments where the facts, the branding, and the billboard are all openly fighting each other in public. That billboard matters because it shows the strategy in its purest form. The accusation is not built to persuade an informed reader on the merits. It's built to hit a commuter at 65 miles an hour with a red warning label and a face. It's political graffiti with a budget. In California, the attack got even uglier. GOP Representative Michelle Steele ran ads against Democrat Jay Chen using doctored imagery and language meant to make him look like a communist sympathizer. That drew backlash from AAPI groups who described the ads as racist and misleading rather than substantive. Again, the lesson is not that Republicans accidentally went too far. The lesson is that the tactic itself depends on visual guilt by association. If the argument can't be made honestly, it can still be made loudly, colorfully, and with enough stereotypes to do the rest of the work. Vice President J.D. Vance has also joined the chorus, warning that communism is something we haven't seen in the U.S., in reference to progressive candidates. That's a strange thing to say in a country with a long history of socialist and communist movements, even if they were never the majority view. The claim only makes sense if you flatten history into a propaganda cartoon. Then everything left of center becomes evidence of a national collapse that only the right is brave enough to name. And that's the real trick here. Trump and his allies are not using communism as a precise ideological category. They're using it as a universal insult that can absorb unrelated fears. Taxation, communism. Public housing, communism. Healthcare debate, communism. Student activism, communism. Progressive candidates, communism. Immigrants, maybe communism too if the speech needs more fuel. That's not analysis, that's rhetorical spam, and not the kind you eat because that's delicious. The media reporting around this has been pretty clear about the strategy. Reuters describes Trump invoking communism dozens of times in a short span as aides test whether the message resonates beyond the base. CNN framed it as a midterm campaign message meant to cast Democrats as godless communists and a civilizational threat. The Guardian called it the Red Scare revival. Those are not accidental labels. They reflect what the messaging is doing in plain view, turning the election into a referendum on whether the country is sliding into an internal enemy fantasy. What makes this especially effective is that the Republicans get to collapse completely different things into the same emotional bucket. Democratic socialism is not the same as communism. The DSA is not the Democratic Party. A progressive candidate is not a Marxist regime. But the campaign doesn't need those distinctions to survive. In fact, the campaign is stronger when those distinctions are blurred, because then it can borrow the most frightening version of each label and hand it to the average voter without explanation. That's where the Democrats keep making life harder for themselves. They often want the energy, the volunteers, the turnout, and the enthusiasm that comes with the left flank, but they don't always want the cost of clearly separating the party's governing coalition from its more radical branding. So instead of drawing a firm line in public, they manage the tension quietly and hope voters don't notice. But Republicans absolutely notice. They notice the ambiguity and then they weaponize it. The result is a very clear bridge from a small number of openly socialist or DSA aligned candidates to the entire Democratic brand. Republicans don't need to convince everyone that the party is radical. They only need to convince people that the party won't say no clearly enough. In politics, hesitation can look a lot like guilt. And all of this is happening because the GOP needs a midterm message that can compete with the boring reality of actual life. People are worried about affordability. They're tired of constant political noise. They're skeptical of both parties. That's not a great environment for a nuanced policy pitch, but it is a great environment for fear. Fear is simpler. Fear is stickier. Fear gives you a villain, and villains are much easier to campaign against than a spreadsheet. So when Trump says Democrats are the most serious threat to our country since its existence, or warns about communist danger on our shore, he's not trying to win a seminar debate. He's trying to create a mental shortcut. Democrats equal danger. Danger equals emergency. Emergency equals loyalty test. That's how scare politics works. It turns ordinary disagreement into civilizational alarm. And because the messaging is so over the top, it has that kind of comic insanity to it. One minute, it's taxes in schools. The next, it's third world Marxist regime, tyrannical Marxist nation, or some other phrase that sounds like it was generated by a 1950s fever dream with a cable news producer on speakerphone. That absurdity is not flaw, it's a feature. Overstatement is the signal. The bigger the threat, the less the audience pauses to ask whether the accusation makes sense. So here's the bigger warning. The return of communist messaging is not just about Trump being Trump or Republicans reaching for an old-fashioned insult. It's about what happens when a party senses vulnerability and decides that fear is more reliable than persuasion. It's also what happens when the opposition leaves enough ambiguity on the table that the attack can travel farther than it should. If Democrats want to stop helping this frame stick, they need more than a quiet internal disagreement. They need a public boundary. Not because every left-wing activist is a problem, but because voters do not reward parties that look vague about their own identity. If they don't define the line, Republicans will. And if Republicans keep pushing this nonsense, they may get short-term applause from their base, but they're also teaching the country a familiar bad habit. That the fastest way to win an election is to make people afraid of the label they barely understand. That may work in the moment. It usually leaves the politics worse afterwards. That's the real danger here. Not that America is secretly becoming communist. It isn't. The danger is that scare politics are becoming the default setting again. Because they're easier than governing and louder than honesty. When both parties are weak, the vacuum gets filled by panic. And panic, once it becomes a campaign strategy, has a way of outlasting the people who started it. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Kyle Fields. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.